find myself duty-bound to oppose this nomination, and I strongly urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to take seriously their obligation, both to the Constitution and to the institutional prerogatives of the Senate, and to do the same. Thank you, Mr. President.
Oh, okay.
Mr. President.
Senator from California is recognized.
Mr. President, I'd like to briefly respond to Senator Lee's comments, and I understand the reasons for which he is opposing this nominee. I would again point out that, in my opinion, based on what I heard the distinguished senator say, it has nothing to do with the nominee. It has to do with a peripheral issue. I would hope that a majority of the Senate would understand that this is a totally non-controversial, totally capable, totally qualified, and totally good nominee. And to hold her confirmation hostage, I think, is something that really doesn't redound well on this body. This is a judicial emergency in the Southern District of California, and we need to get this judge approved. I appreciate the senator's comments. I think most of us are well aware of the feelings on the other side. I just think somehow, some way, we have to come together and prevent what's happening. And what's happening is, if I don't get my way on something, I'm going to hold up appointments, I'm going to hold up confirmations, I'm going to do whatever I can to show that I have power to disrupt this body. And in essence, the body can be disrupted. We know that. There are very strong minority rights in the Senate Rules of Order. But at the same time, we have an obligation to see that qualified people who want to serve in this government, in this case in the judicial arm of the federal court system, have an opportunity to do so. And that where there is real danger in terms of overly high caseloads, we can respond and get qualified nominees in place. So I appreciate what the senator had to say. I understand it, but I appeal to this body, please vote to approve Kathy Benjavengo to the Southern District of California. Thank you very much. I yield the floor. I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
A vote on whether to proceed to the surface transportation bill is expected momentarily here in the Senate. Congressional Quarterly writes that this could be the last major floor activity of the week. Today, President Obama announced that 10 states will be free from requirements of the No Child Left Behind law in exchange for promises to improve the way schools teach and evaluate students. The first 10 states to receive the waivers are Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Jersey, Oklahoma, and Tennessee. The only state that applied for the flexibility and did not get it is New Mexico, which is still working with the administration to get approval. The president said that he was acting because Congress had failed to update the law despite widespread agreement that it needs to be fixed. We have the president's remarks. We covered that today. We're going to have it for you later in our schedule.
Mr. President, I
Senator
ask,
from California is recognized.
thank you. I ask the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection. The question is on the nomination.
Mr. President, I ask for the yeas and nays on the nominee,
Is
Catherine Benjamin.
there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley.
I know you want to stay, but you can't.
Mrs. Hagan.
Most of the serious discussion, you gotta go. Michael.
Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch.
But I'm not a lawyer, I'm a lawyer.
Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. It is. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Ayotte, Begich, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Burr, Cardin, Casey, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Hatch, Hutchison, Inhofe, Inouye, Isaacson, Johnson of Wisconsin, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Lieberman, Lugar, McConnell, Pryor, Sanders, Sessions, and Warner. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Dement, Lee, Paul, and Rubio. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Hoeven. Mr. Hoeven, aye.
Flip the coin. This is very difficult.
Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Vitter, aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Johans, aye. Ms. Snow, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Conrad, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Florida, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Yeah. Mr. Webb, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Carey. Mr. Carey, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye.
No, actually.
Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye.
Are there any senators who have not yet voted or wish to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 90, the nays are 6, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table. The President shall be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative session. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to Calendar 311, S-1813, a bill to reauthorize federal aid highway and highway safety construction programs and for other purposes. Signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S-1813, a bill to reauthorize federal aid, highway and highway safety construction programs and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. DeMint, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inoue, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Baucus, Bennett, Blunt, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Burr, Carper, Casey, Coates, Coburn, Collins, Conrad, Cornyn, Crapo, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Heller, Hutchison, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Cole, Kyle, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Levin, Lugar, Manchin, McCaskill, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Nevada, Sanders, Shaheen, Shelby, Snow, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Udall of Colorado, Vitter, Webb, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Cantwell, Hatch, Johanns, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, Murkowski, and Paul. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner? Aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi? Aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker? Aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal? Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? Aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman? Aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin? Aye. Mr. DeMint. Mr. DeMint? No. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss? Aye. Mr. Begich? Mr. Begich? No. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mr. Cochran? Mr. Cochran? Aye. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio? No. Mr. Franken? Mr. Franken? Aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? No. Ms. Klobuchar? Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall of New Mexico? Aye. Mr. Rockefeller? Mr. Rockefeller? Aye. Mr. Inouye? Mr. Inouye? Aye. Mr. Lieberman? Mr. Lieberman? Aye. Mr. McCain? Mr. McCain? Aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Hoven, Mr. Hoven, aye.
Are there any senators who have not yet voted who wish to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 85, the nays are 11. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is